It is 28th March 1941, and the Mediterranean is absolutely black. No moon, no stars visible through the overcast. The sea off Cape Matapan, at the southernmost tip of the Greek Peloponnese, runs cold and deep, and somewhere in that darkness a British destroyer is moving at speed. HMS Jervis, flotilla leader of the 14th Destroyer Flotilla, cuts through the water at nearly 30 knots, her bow wave a pale smear of phosphorescence in the blackness. Her captain Philip Mack stands on the bridge. He knows exactly where the enemy is. The Italians do not know he is coming. Below the surface of this moment lies a revolution. Not a revolution in gunnery, though the guns will matter. Not a revolution in seamanship, though the seamanship will be extraordinary. A revolution in information, in the ability to see in total darkness what your enemy cannot see at all. The weapon that is about to decide the fate of 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers is not a torpedo, not a shell, not a depth charge. It is a cathode ray tube, a rotating aerial, and a pulse of radio energy travelling at the speed of light. This is the story of how British radar, deployed at sea in the earliest and most primitive form any navy had ever attempted, annihilated an Italian fleet in the space of 3 minutes. Before sunrise on March the 29th, 1941, 3 cruisers, the Zara, the Polar, and the Fiume, would be on the bottom of the Mediterranean. 2 destroyers would follow. Nearly 3,000 Italian sailors would be dead. HMS Jervis would not have a single man scratched. And the instrument that made all of this possible cost, in its earliest form, less than a modern family motorcar. To understand why what happened at Cape Matapan was so decisive, you have to understand the Mediterranean in early 1941. Britain was losing. Not gradually, not partially. Losing in almost every theatre that mattered. Greece was about to fall. Crete was under threat. The supply lines that kept the 8th Army fighting in North Africa ran directly through waters that the Italian Regia Marina considered its own, and with considerable justification. Italy had the largest navy in the Mediterranean by tonnage. Her heavy cruisers, the Zara class displacing over 11,000 tons apiece, were fast, well-armed and modern. They carried 8-inch guns capable of striking targets at 20 kilometres. Against such vessels, a British destroyer was outgunned by a factor that made direct confrontation, in any conventional sense, suicidal. The Royal Navy's problem was not courage, its problem was information. In daylight, British ships could be spotted, shadowed, and engaged at ranges that negated their advantages in torpedo armament. At night, both sides were essentially blind. Traditional naval doctrine held that night actions were too dangerous to risk with capital ships, too easy to mistake friend for foe, too difficult to aim accurately, too likely to produce catastrophic, friendly fire incidents. The Italian Navy, in particular, had trained its officers to avoid night engagements. This was a doctrine built entirely on the assumption that darkness equalised the contest, that neither side could see. That assumption was about to be destroyed. The system that destroyed it had been developed at the Admiralty Signal Establishment at Whitley in Surrey, working in close collaboration with scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, which had by 1941 relocated to Swanage in Dorset. The principle of radar, radio detection and ranging, had been established by Robert Watson Watt and his team at Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk as early as 1935, initially as a means of detecting aircraft. The challenge of adapting it for shipborne use was formidable. A land-based radar station could be as large as necessary. A ship's radar had to fit within the constraints of a warship's superstructure, survive the concussion of the ship's own guns firing, operate in salt spray and high humidity, and produce results accurate enough to be operationally useful in real time. The system installed aboard HMS Valiant, the battleship whose radar fix would ultimately guide the destroyers onto their targets that night, was the Type 279, a metric wavelength air search radar, but the instrument that actually located the drifting Italian cruiser Polar and then tracked the Zara and Fiume as they came to her aid was the Type 284 gunnery control radar fitted aboard HMS Warspite, the fleet flagship. The Type 284 operated on a wavelength of approximately 50 centimetres, transmitting pulses of radio energy and measuring the time taken for the echo to return from a solid target. At a pulse speed of 300,000 kilometres per second, the mathematics were elegant. The time delay, divided by 2 and multiplied by the speed of light, gave range with an accuracy, in good conditions, of approximately 50 metres at distances up to 15 kilometres. The rotating aerial, a distinctive mattress-shaped array of deep-hole elements mounted above the bridge, could be trained on a specific bearing and would return a blip on the cathode ray tube display below decks with each sweep. The operator read range directly from a calibrated scale on the tube face. Bearing came from the aerial's known orientation. From these two numbers, a plot could be constructed, a plot that showed, in the absolute darkness of the Mediterranean night, exactly where the enemy was, exactly how fast he was moving, and exactly what course he was steering. The Italian officers on the bridges of Zara and Fiume had no equivalent. They were, in the most literal sense, blind. Production of the Type 284 was centred on Metropolitan Vickers in Manchester and a number of smaller subcontractors across the Midlands. The sets were hand-built by skilled engineers, not mass-produced in the modern sense, and installation required specialist teams from the Admiralty Signal Establishment. By March 1941, fewer than 40 British warships carried any form of surface search or gunnery radar. The technology was new, imperfectly understood, even by many of the officers who commanded the ships that carried it, and still being refined with each operational deployment. The night of 28th March began with an airstrike. A swordfish torpedo bomber from HMS Formidable had already struck the Italian heavy cruiser Polar earlier in the evening, leaving her dead in the water approximately 96 kilometres south of Cape Matapan. The Italian admiral, Angelo Iachino, not knowing that the British Mediterranean fleet under Admiral Andrew Cunningham was at sea in strength, ordered the cruisers Zara and Fiume, with 4 destroyers, to return and assist the stricken Polar. It was a decision made in ignorance. Iachino had no radar, he had no aircraft aloft, he had no information whatsoever about what was waiting for him in the darkness. Cunningham, by contrast, knew almost everything. His radar operators had tracked the Polar. They were now tracking the Zara and Fiume as they approached at moderate speed, their crews apparently unaware that anything was wrong. At 22:27, HMS Warspite's Type 284 acquired the Zara at a range of approximately 3,800 metres, less than 4 kilometres. The ships were close enough that a man with good eyesight might, in daylight, have been able to read the numbers painted on the Italian vessel's hull. In the darkness, the Italian lookouts saw nothing. Cunningham gave the order. The searchlights of HMS Warspite and HMS Valiant snapped on simultaneously, their beams crossing and fixing on the Zara. For a fraction of a second, the Italian cruiser was illuminated in brilliant white light, her crew frozen on deck, her guns still trained fore and aft in the peacetime position. Then Warspite's 15-inch guns fired. The first salvo struck Zara at a range of close to 3,000 metres. At that distance, a 15-inch shell weighing nearly 900 kilograms does not simply hit a ship. It passes through multiple decks before detonating. The Zara was effectively destroyed by the first 2 salvos. The Fiume, caught simultaneously by HMS Valiant, lasted barely longer. Both ships were burning, listing, and beyond saving within 3 minutes of the searchlights coming on. The destroyers moved in to finish the work with torpedoes. The Polar, still drifting, was dispatched by HMS Jervis and HMS Nubian before dawn. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The contrast between British and Italian radar capability in 1941 was not merely a matter of technology, it was a matter of institutional priority. The Regia Marina had conducted experiments with radio ranging equipment. The Italian EC3 Gufo system, meaning OWL, was a functional radar that would eventually be fitted to Italian vessels. But in March 1941, it had not yet entered operational service. The Italian Navy had not invested in radar with the urgency that the Royal Navy had, partly because the Mediterranean appeared to offer less need for it. Clear skies, calmer waters, shorter operational ranges than the North Atlantic. The strategic assumption was that daytime operations, with good visibility, would be the norm. Cape Matapan demonstrated the catastrophic cost of that assumption. The German Kriegsmarine, by comparison, had developed the SeaTact radar system, which was fitted to several major surface units, including the Bismarck and Scharnhorst. SeaTact operated on a wavelength of 80 centimetres and could detect large surface targets at ranges of up to 25 kilometres under good conditions. It was, in some respects, technically comparable to early British sets. But German naval doctrine, like Italian doctrine, had not yet fully absorbed what radar meant for night fighting. The Bismarck carried SeaTact when she sailed on her fatal sortie in May 1941, 2 months after Cape Matapan. And yet the tactical advantage it might have provided was never fully exploited before HMS Dorsetshire's torpedoes ended the matter. The United States Navy, entering the war in December 1941, brought with it the CXAM radar system, fitted to its larger surface units. American radar development had proceeded on a parallel but separate track to British work, and the two allies rapidly began sharing technology and doctrine through the TISAD mission of 1940. One of the most consequential scientific exchanges in the history of warfare, the cavity magnetron, a British invention that made centimetric radar practical, was handed to the Americans essentially without conditions. An act of technological generosity that accelerated Allied radar development by an estimated 2 years. What Cape Matapan established, beyond the immediate tactical result, was a doctrinal revolution. Night actions were no longer inherently equalizing. A fleet with radar and a fleet without radar were not fighting the same battle in the dark. They were fighting entirely different battles, one with information and one without. Cunningham understood this. His battle report, submitted to the Admiralty in the days following the action, was explicit. The radar fix on the Polar had made the entire operation possible. Without it, the fleet would not have been positioned. Without the gunnery radar, the first salvo would not have been accurate enough to destroy the Zara before she could return fire or take evasive action. Without the Type 284, 3 Italian cruisers would almost certainly have survived the night. The legacy of Cape Matapan runs forward through the entire subsequent history of naval warfare. The principle it demonstrated, that information dominance in a contested environment is more decisive than raw firepower, has shaped naval doctrine from 1941 to the present day. Modern naval combat systems, the Aegis radar and fire control systems fitted to American and Allied destroyers, the Type 997 artisan radar aboard the Royal Navy's Type 45 destroyers, the entire architecture of networked maritime warfare. All of it descends in a direct conceptual line from the cathode ray tube displays and rotating mattress aerials that gave Andrew Cunningham his eyes in the darkness off Cape Matapan. HMS Warspite survived the war and was sold for scrapping in 1947, though she ran aground off Prussia Cove in Cornwall before she could be broken up, and her remains are still occasionally visible at very low tides. A memorial to the Battle of Cape Matapan stands at Piraeus in Greece, and the Italian Navy commemorates the battle annually, a measure of how deeply it marks the institutional memory of the Regia Marina. Return then to the bridge of HMS Jervis, to Captain Philip Mack standing in absolute darkness, watching a cathode ray tube display in the hands of a rating 2 decks below him, receiving position reports by voice pipe, and knowing, with a certainty no naval officer in history had possessed before radar, exactly where his enemy was. The Zara is already burning. The Fiume has capsized. The Polar is drifting and helpless. In an hour it will be over. 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, nearly 3,000 men. Before sunrise, the Italians never saw a thing, and the instrument that blinded them, that stripped away the darkness they had counted on, that turned the Mediterranean night from a shield into a trap, weighed less than 2 tons, consumed less power than a suburban house, and had been built by hand in a workshop in Manchester, by engineers who had never fired a gun in their lives. That is what radar did at Cape Matapan. It did not sink the ships. The shells sank the ships. The torpedoes sank the ships. But radar decided, before a single gun was loaded, which ships would survive the night. And the answer on March 29, 1941, was not the Italian ones.